Well, Irina Papkova is currently a research fellow at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. She spent 5 years teaching at the Department of International Relations and European Studies at the Central European University in Budapest. She has held research fellowships at the Kennan Institute and at the Vienna Institute for Human Sciences. Her research agenda has been defined by general interest in the relationship between religion and politics, leading to her ongoing work on the situation of Middle Eastern Christians in the context of the Arab Spring, and her publications include The Orthodox Church and Russian Politics from 2011, Russian Orthodox Concordat, Church and State under Medvedev, and Great Power Misalignment, the United States and the Russo-Georgia conflict in Great Power Mismanagement, the Russia-Georgian War and its implications for global political order. Fluent in Russian and French, she received her BA magna cum laude in French with a minor in history from Hamilton College, an MA in Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies, and a PhD in government from Georgetown University. The title for her presentation today, State, Church, and National Identity in Putin's Russia. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Irina Papkova.
All right, thank you very much for this wonderful introduction, and also thank you to all of you for coming and hopefully perhaps learning something from my presentation today, I hope. This will be a somewhat unusual presentation for me in the sense that I'm going to talk about everything and nothing. Everything in the sense of everything that's in here is the product of a lot of research over the years into the complicated relationship between church and state in Russia, and nothing in the sense that there's no sort of central idea here in this talk today. It's pretty much about the things that I happen to find interesting about religion, specifically Orthodox religion, politics, and national identity in Russia. So somewhere in there are some interesting ideas, I think. But if you're looking for sort of a very well-structured kind of approach, this is not the lecture that you should have come to. But hopefully still you will learn something. And I will do my best to keep it down to about 25, maybe 30 minutes to give you some time to ask questions, assuming, of course, that there will be questions afterwards. So my talk, as you see, is about state, church, and national identity. And really, there's one main question which drives my presentation today, which is that once the Soviet Union collapsed, as you know, since the majority of you are Russian studies or Russia students, up until for a good 70 years, there was a very concrete ideology in the space that we now think of as the former Soviet space. And that ideology was communism. And it was an atheistic ideology. And once communism collapsed and once the Soviet Union dissolved into 15 different countries, the largest country to come out of that mess was the Russian Federation, what we typically refer to as Russia today. And one of the central questions that immediately stood in front of the Russian government was, what do we do in terms of a Russian national ideology? And this is important because in Russian society there was this question of what does it mean to be Russian in this post-imperial, post-Soviet context. And the Russian government has tried sort of with limited success to arrive at an ideology that would answer this question. And so the question that drives this discussion here today is the search of the government of the Russian Federation for an official ideology, and the question of what kind of society should post-Soviet Russia be, and what is the place of the Russian Orthodox Church within it? Because again, as students of Russia, you know that the Russian Orthodox Church is the predominant confession in the Russian Federation. It's a church that has claimed historically to be the predominant religion on that territory for 1,000 years. And so it was suppressed in various ways during the communist era. And the question is, in the post-Soviet time, what kind of role should it have in this post-secular, post-Soviet, post-communist, post-atheist Russian society? So that's essentially the question that my talk today explores, and what my work on Russia has explored, generally speaking. And for the sake of sort of breaking it down, I look at today the way in which this question has developed across the 3 time periods. I won't talk to you today about how developments under the Yeltsin administration, but we'll start with what we now know of, or what we can refer to as the Putin era, right? And the Putin era can be roughly divided into 3 parts, as you see. You have the first and second Putin terms, which were from late 1999 to 2008. What I refer to as the Medvedev interregnum, or the period of sort of uncertain, where nobody still really knows how to define what that was, from 2008 to 2012, when Medvedev was the president and Putin was prime minister. And then we have Putin's term 3, right? And the thing is, one of the things which you will find, hopefully, from my talk, is that it's become commonplace in discussions of Russian politics for people, wise people doing Russian studies, to say that, well, you know, the Medvedev period was really just a sham, that there was no difference whatsoever between Medvedev and Putin, so really we can talk about this period as also belonging to the Putin era. And along some important parameters, that is true. But when it comes to the place of Russian orthodoxy within Russian society, that's my research has found that in that aspect, the 2 presidencies were actually quite different. And so it really does matter that Medvedev was the president for 4 years and not Putin between 2008 and 2012, for our understanding of the position of the Orthodox Church in Russian society and Russian politics. And that might be the only area in which it actually mattered. I don't know, but it does matter here. So that, roughly speaking, is the structure of the talk, so you can follow along chronologically. And so, of course, here we have Putin, and I took a while yesterday trying to find, you know, the most representative photo I could. I just thought the dark glasses are cool because I'm a big fan of, you know, aviator glasses. So there we are. Okay, so you know who that is, right? That's Putin. This man, you may not know who that is. That was the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Alexey II, who was the head of the Russian Orthodox Church from the year 1990 all the way until 2008. And why does it matter? One of the arguments that I make in this talk is that personalities really do matter. Again, as students of Russian, you probably have come across, you know, if you've read Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and all of these, you know, Russian writers and philosophers, you know, there's this big question of, you know, does the individual matter in historical events, or does, you know, are there larger historical processes that drive everything, meaning that the individual doesn't matter? And if you've read War and Peace, you know that Tolstoy's big idea was that, you know, Napoleon really didn't matter so much, right? That it was larger historical processes that drove what happened at that time period. My argument, at least here, would be that in the case of the position of the Orthodox Church in Russia in the post-Soviet era, their personality does matter. And the 2 types of personalities that I identify as important are the personality of the Patriarch, who is the head of the Russian Church, and the personality of the person, the man in this case, occupying the position of President of the Russian Federation. So, for this reason, I wanted to pause a little bit and talk about Alexey II, and you will see later why I think he's an important figure for you to know about. The important thing, there are several important things I think to say about him. The first of which is that he was the first freely elected leader of the Russian Church from 1917. So the last patriarch who had been freely elected had been elected freely in 1917. In 1990, when this man was elected patriarch of the Russian Church, this was the first and probably only time in the history of Russia since 1917 when the government had no direct influence on who the church picked as its leader. So he was freely chosen by a council of that included actually both clergy and lay people. So there were women, there were men who were not priests, and bishops and monks who were all gathered together in Moscow, and they picked him as the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church. And symbolically, this was important because it symbolized the end of atheist domination of the Soviet Union and the beginning of what at the time seemed to be a period of flourishing religious freedom. And so those are the circumstances under which he came into power as patriarch. The second important thing to say about Alexey II is that as a personality, he was not particularly interested in politics. He understood the role of the state as one that should be helpful to religion or Orthodoxy specifically in rebuilding after a period of destruction, because by the time freedom of religion came to Russia in 1990, the church had been, and other also religions, had been almost completely eradicated or very severely repressed. And so the infrastructure of the Orthodox Church had been very heavily damaged. There were many destroyed and damaged churches. There were not almost any monasteries open. There was a very small availability of religious education and so forth. So basically they had to start from scratch, rebuilding religious, and in this case, Orthodox life. And as you also probably know, being students of Russia, and you know that this was the period of time when there were a lot of missionaries coming to Russia from the United States, bringing other types of Christianity to Russian soil, also based on the idea that after 70 years, there was a real need for religious revival. And so the focus of the years of Alexey II's patriarchate were really on reviving the infrastructure and on getting the government to sort of support the revival of the infrastructure. The logic being that since it was the government that had destroyed or tried to destroy the church or religion generally in Russia during the communist period, it was the responsibility of the government to help build it back up. So there was nothing wrong with asking the government for subsidies to rebuild churches, for example, because they'd blown them up, but they might as well pay for rebuilding them, or some of them anyway. But the important thing to emphasize is that despite the fact that he worked very closely with the government and he encouraged his clergy to work closely with the government in the rebuilding of religious infrastructure, he did not. He also believed that the church should be above politics and stay out of it. So, during his period as patriarch, there was actually a rule which stated that if you were a Russian Orthodox priest or a bishop, you could not run for government office. Right? You had to stay out of politics altogether. You couldn't really give your support for one party or another. And so the idea was to sort of keep the church, visible in the public eye, but at the same time make sure that it does not become a part of the state apparatus, right? So keeping it independent from government control. And Alexey II actually very heavily believed in not making the Russian Orthodox Church the state church of Russia. So constitutionally, he did not want it to be constitutionally made the state religion, right? So, which did not mean that he didn't want, all of Russians to be Orthodox, right? But that's a different thing, right? So keep that in mind as I talk somewhat further. So what was the Orthodox vision of what Russia should be like in the post-communist time period? And again, this is something that was developed under Alexey II's tenure. First of all, it was sort of believed that the church should be the moral center of Russian society. And again, there was no desire for it to be the state church. So the idea was that people should naturally turn to the church for advice on kind of moral and ethical issues, but that it shouldn't be kind of an ideological department telling people how to live their lives backed up by government laws, right? So it should be the predominant confession, that there should be some form of religious education in school. And by that, they meant that there should be at least the opportunity for students in public schools to take classes on religion, specifically Orthodox religion, to learn about it. And there was some debate about whether this should be mandatory or voluntary, but the idea was that the government should allow religious education in schools. And that there should be chaplains in the Russian army, which was something that did not exist throughout the Soviet time period for obvious reasons. And also the final thing was that there should be a restitution of property, in the sense that the state should give the church back everything that it had lost, or at least sort of compensate it for the losses that it suffered in the communist period. And the other thing, which goes back to this idea of predominant confession, the church did heavily lobby the state to limit foreign missionaries from coming in and spreading other types of Christian or non-Christian ideas on Russian soil. And if you look at this list of what we could call the Orthodox demands on the state, right, as an institution that lobbies the government, right, the only thing that the church received from 1990 until 2008 was this third piece, which is the predominant confession, or a law that the government passed in 1997 limiting the activity of missionaries on Russian soil. So you see on this, it looks like a kind of big list, and off of this big list they got one thing. And of course, if you are a missionary and you wanted to come to Russia and spread, your faith, this was a big deal. But in the scheme of the things in which the church actually asked the government for a lot more than that, one of the arguments I've made is that really the Orthodox churches during that time period failed really to get the government to do what it wanted to do, with the one big exception of limiting missionary activity. So that is what I can say about that. The state vision of what Russia should be like and what kind of society Russia should have during the same time period was actually quite different. And this is where I find the explanation for why the Putin government in particular from 2000 to 2008 did everything it could to put the brakes on the expansion of the Orthodox presence in Russia. As an example, there was an attempt in 2003 to get federal authorization for the teaching of religious classes in schools. And it happened in the following way. There was a minister of education who himself was sort of a recently converted Orthodox Christian who decided that, as minister of education, it was his duty to ensure that Russian students in public schools could learn about Orthodoxy and about other religions. And so he began a process whereby it looked like he was going to authorize the teaching of Orthodox culture in public schools. And there was a huge public outcry because it turns out that even though the Russian public, by and large, trusted the Orthodox Church as an institution, but many Russian parents did not want their kids to learn about Orthodoxy in schools. They thought that this should be something they should learn either at home or in church, but that it was not the government's business to teach this class or to allow this class in public schools, which are paid for by taxpayers, some of whom include, Muslims, atheists, Jews, and Buddhists, Protestants, and other religions. So there was an outcry, and actually it was Putin who very quietly, himself as president, kind of informally put the brakes on this project and said, made it be known from on high from his office that he thought this was a bad idea. And so the minister who had tried to push the teaching of Orthodox culture in schools was actually fired over this and was replaced by a minister who had a completely different idea and who actually said that, what we should be doing is teaching world religion, the history of world religions in public schools, sort of in a comparative way. And so that's just an example of how the Russian government, under Putin's first 2 terms, despite the fact that they officially got along quite well with the church, and you would see the meetings of the Patriarch with Putin, and Putin would come to church on Easter and Christmas and on other occasions and demonstrate the fact that he was a sort of more or less believing Christian or Orthodox Christian. But as far as sanctifying or allowing the church to kind of define what it is to be Russian and allowing the church to take on this much more public role, the Putin government was actually quite against this. And one of the reasons, there were 2 reasons, actually 3 I have here on the board, for this. And the first reason had to do with the fact that under Putin, the state ideology actually became more and more secular as time went on. And you could tell this if you looked at the political party platform of the party that Putin was officially, well, he was not technically a member of it, but it was the party that was, everybody knew that it was his party, right, which was Единство, or Unity, right? And if you look at Unity's party platforms over this time period, in the early 2000s, they still referred to Orthodoxy or some kind of spirituality as part of what they thought people should vote for. But then when you look at it deeper, you would realize what they mean by spirituality had nothing to do with religion. It had to do with ballet and music and culture. And the central idea of the party platform of this political party, Единство, was that Russia should be a wealthy, capitalist space where everybody has a worthy life, and by worthy life they meant wealthy life. They did not mean a life that really had room or any need for religion. And that was one way in which you could tell that the government was not really interested in orthodoxy as a state ideology. And the other thing was that if you look, there's a tradition in the Russian Federation, much like the one we have here, of the presidential addresses once a year. So we have their State of the Union address that we have here. And in Russia, you have exactly the same thing. Once a year, the Russian president goes and reads a speech to the Russian Duma in which he says, you know, this is where we are, this is what we should be doing. And if you look at the presidential addresses of Putin from the years 2000 to 2008, they become progressively more secular over the years. If he refers to spirituality into the year 2000, by the year 2004, he does not refer to it at all. Right? There's none of this idea in the official government discourse that Russian Orthodoxy is an ideology on which the Russian state should lean in order to define what it is to be Russian, right? It's completely missing. And in fact, it becomes less and, even if there were sort of any signs of it, they become less and less visible over the time period that Putin is in office. And why does this happen? Well, there's two reasons. One of which is that obviously Russia is a multicultural, multinational federation, and there's a fairly significant population of Muslims. There are other religious traditions represented in Russia that have fairly significant populations, and in order for all of them to get along, it's very unhelpful for the Orthodox Church to be officially labeled as the dominant confession, right? And the second thing is actually a more important element of this, I think, is that early on, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was this idea that Russians would vote according to religious affiliation. So if they were Orthodox, they would vote according to the way the Orthodox Church would teach them to vote, right? Or if they were Muslim, they would vote according to like their, whatever the Muslim leadership told them to vote for. And through the years, in the 1990s, the Russian politicians believed that this was the case. And they believed that this was the case because they were not following the surveys that were being done by social scientists, both in Russia and by American social scientists who came to Russia and discovered that religion had nothing to do with how Russians actually vote. There were surveys that demonstrated that religious belief had no influence whatsoever on whom Russians actually voted for at the poll booth. And the thing is, all the way up until 2004, this actually really mattered in Russia, because we can talk about elections in Russia becoming progressively less free, but up until 2004, it actually really still was it did matter why people voted or didn't vote, right? So because of this, the Russian government finally figured this out around the year 2000, and after that sort of stopped really thinking of orthodoxy as an ideology that would be important for them. So such was the case in what we can call Putin term 1, right? And then you get the year 2008. And before I continue, the consequence of this, as I said, was the failure of the Orthodox Church's effort to achieve anything other than the law that they had passed in the year 1997, limiting missionaries. Otherwise, there was no chaplaincy in the army, there was no restitution of property, there was no teaching, or at least government-sponsored teaching of religious ideas in school. Even though it did happen, it happened on the regional level, but not in a way that was actually supported by the federal state. But still, the relationship was sort of courteous and, a good one, supportive, sort of officially. And one thing which did happen, and this is kind of an important thing, was that in one aspect in which Putin did take an active role in sort of supporting the Orthodox Church was in 2007, when, and I'm not going to get into the very long historical details of this, but very briefly, after the revolution, the Russian Orthodox Church had split into two parts, one which was sort of the part that stayed in Russia, and one which consisted of Russian Orthodox Christians who left Russia after the revolution. And they remained both Orthodox in dogma, but in terms of administrative unity, they were not, they were separated, because the Orthodox Church in what was termed exile was very anti-communist and did not want to be under the authority of a church that seemed to be, that was actually repressed and dominated by the communist regime. So for about 70 years, the two branches of the Russian Orthodox Church were separated. In the year 2007, as you can see in this picture, they reconciled. And they reconciled partially because Putin kind of got involved and mediated between them. But in terms of church and state and society, this was pretty much the only really significant thing that Putin was involved in during his presidency. And it was interesting because I was there at this ceremony where they signed the agreement of reconciliation, and Putin gave a speech at which he actually said that for him this was kind of the unification of the church was a kind of symbolic of the unification of Russia, right? Of kind of a healing of the wounds of Russian society after years of civil war and political disagreements. You can guess whether or not he was sincere in this or whether this was a huge PR, as they would say in Russian, PR akция. But if you look at Putin's record in terms of how he approached the Orthodox Church, this was probably the most significant thing that he did in that time period. Then, of course, in 2008, Putin steps down and becomes prime minister, and you get this man who's Dmitry Medvedev. I couldn't find a picture of him in which he looked cool in dark sunglasses, so here he is without them. And as you know, and as I mentioned before, for a long time, the assumption was that, as I had people, friends of mine or acquaintances, would sort of derisively refer to him as that little tadpole from St. Petersburg who had really no kind of personal importance, that he was kind of just a stand-in for Vladimir Putin, who really, pulled the strings behind the throne. But as I said before, the reality is that the one area in which Medvedev's presidency actually mattered was in the intensification of the presence of the Orthodox Church in Russian society and in the ability of the Russian Church to achieve what it wanted to achieve before under Putin and could not. So in the space of the 4 years that Medvedev was Russian president, several things happened. First of all, the government did allow a certain type of teaching of religious education in schools across the country. It was a modified form of a class on Orthodox culture that was supposed to be also students have a choice between 4 different types of education. One was Orthodox culture, the other was Muslim culture, the third was, I think, world religions, and the fourth, I think, was secular ethics. I don't exactly remember the 4 categories, but there were 4 choices that people could make. And the idea was that, of course, Russia being a supposedly fully Orthodox society, that parents would choose Orthodox culture for their children. This is a side note, that didn't happen. Most Russian parents chose secular ethics as the course that their children would take. But the point is the government did allow Orthodox classes to be taught in schools. The second thing happened was that Medvedev allowed the institution of the chaplaincy in the Russian army. So now you have paid chaplains, both Orthodox and Muslim, and I think there might be 1 or 2 Buddhist, and there might be a rabbi or something, but the point is that he allowed this. And again, this is something that Putin had resisted doing. And the fourth thing, which is probably more spectacular, Medvedev actually also took large steps forward in facilitating the restitution of church property, which was, again, something that the Putin era had not allowed. And why was this the case? Well, there are lots of different theories, but the one which I subscribe to, and I think that it's actually probably correct, it has to do with the role of personal religiosity. And Medvedev, to a larger degree than Putin, actually does seriously attend church, and in particular his wife is a very religious person. And being a very religious person, she had contacts within the administration of the Russian Orthodox Church, and was able to, the theory is that she was able to kind of, persuade her husband to do the things that I've just described. And the other thing which was important is, how does this? Sorry. The other thing, again, that is important goes back again to the idea that personalities are important. Because in 2008, not only did the president of Russia change faces, so it was now Medvedev instead of Putin, in 2008 you also had the death of Alexey II, the Patriarch of the Russian Church. And he was replaced by this man, who is still currently the Patriarch of Russia, and his name is Patriarch Kirill I. And the thing about Kirill is that there's lots of different things I could say about Kirill, but for our purposes, it's very important to note that he is a much more actively missionary personality than Alexey II was. So under Kirill, first of all, he's a much better speaker than Alexey. He's known for his oratorial skills. For many years before he became patriarch, he had a kind of weekly television show in which he would sort of broadcast nationally and talk to people about Russian Orthodoxy. And so he was a well-known figure in Russia in that sense. So he's a kind of more persuasive character. He is also a much more dynamic personality. And so under Patriarch Kirill, the Russian Orthodox Church immediately, once he became patriarch, it experienced an activization of mission. He came in and he said, we're going to be a missionary church. We're going to go to the people, and now that we've rebuilt the church infrastructure, but now we need to fill it with people who are actually Orthodox, and we're going to go tell them what Orthodoxy is and sort of bring them into the church as full members of the Orthodox Church, and not just people who go to church once a year, maybe. And this was accompanied by all sorts of popular actions, such as he would fill stadiums and preach to stadiums. There was this phenomenon of Orthodox bikers going around Russia, sort of preaching the Orthodoxy. There was this idea that there's churches should be built across the country in such a way that in major cities people would be able to walk to their neighborhood church, which in the case of Moscow meant the building of 400 new churches to again, ensure that everybody had a chance to go to church within walking distance from their house. So from day one of Kirill's patriarchate, you could tell that there was a much more kind of activist presence of the church, which coincided, as I've described to you before, with a president who was willing to allow for that, right? And so here are some of the things that I mentioned. And one of the sort of things that they did, and this was kind of one of the more spectacular missionary attempts, was the staging of an Orthodox fashion show in Moscow, right? And I'll just play just a little bit so you can see what this was. Could you possibly play this? Yeah. And I'm not going to play the whole thing, just maybe like 30 seconds of it, just so you can get a sense of what this was. But and while the video is loading, I might as well take the opportunity to tell you the next part of this story, which is that paradoxically, despite you would think that this would be something that was welcomed by a population that was considered to be culturally and historically Orthodox, but the result actually of the much more active presence of the Orthodox Church in Russian society over the past 4 years was a rising anti-clericalism and a rising sense that people don't want to be told how to live, and this rising idea that the church is too close to the government and that it has become kind of a far too deeply involved with the state. So the end result of the 4 years of Medvedev's presidency was actually the fact that despite being much more visible in Russian society, the Russian society itself was becoming less and less interested in the Orthodox Church itself. Oh, okay. Never mind. I don't know why that happened. I downloaded this yesterday. It worked. So unfortunately, I won't be able to show you. But if you go to YouTube and you type in Orthodox fashion show, that's what you'll be able to find it yourself. Okay. So if we could go back to the PowerPoint presentation, please. Sorry. All right. Well, while the PowerPoint presentation is coming up. There we go. And it could have the next page, which... Okay. And so, as I said, this was, all of this resulted in some people within Russian society becoming kind of upset about the overexposure of the Russian Orthodox Church. And so some of you may have heard of the Pussy Riot scandal, in which this sort of punk band of young ladies, they climbed on in a Russian Orthodox Church, there's this thing called the Saliya, or the Ambo, right, which is in front of the altar. And these women in this punk band, they came to the biggest church in Russia, climbed on the Solia and sort of sang a song or tried to sing a song that had kind of very anti-Putin lyrics, and some of the lyrics there were also very critical of the Patriarch. And to make a long story short, they were arrested, and 3 of them were actually sentenced to 2 years in jail for hooliganism with an anti-religious component. But this was a hugely scandalous event because a lot of people were both outside of Russia and in Russia thought that this was a symbol of the fact that the Orthodox Church had become too powerful in Russia. And the other thing had to do with the fact that the Patriarch himself was known to be quite a wealthy man, and some Russian clergy took to riding in expensive cars and sort of being flashy about the money that they had. And there were several exposés in the year 2000 and maybe 2011 in the mass media about this, which also started to turn people, sort of public opinion, away from sort of unequivocal support for the Russian Church. And all of this coincided with the return of Vladimir Putin to the presidency. And this was kind of the biggest wealth scandal. If you see, what you see there on the left in the circle is a reflection from the table of a very expensive watch, right? Which the Patriarch claimed that he had never owned and never worn. And there he is in the picture, and you can see on his wrist it's not there, right? But then if you look at the reflection off the table, it is. And so somebody figured out that the press service of the church had photoshopped out this watch, right? And once this was exposed, of course, people, they read about it in the social media, and they got very upset. So, adding to the sort of criticism of the church at this time, and if you could play this one, that would be great. And I just wanted to play the sort of 30-second or 40-second Pussy Riot video, because I'm not sure how many of you might have actually seen this. It's been discussed widely in the American media, but I don't think it actually. I actually didn't see it myself until yesterday when I looked it up. But this is essentially what they did, and it's short enough that I think you have time to look at it. So you see they've. And you see these sort of sisters of the Church of Christ the Savior trying to stop this, right? And if we could stop the video, that's okay. What's important here is that you see that this video has no sound, and it lasts only about 30 seconds. What the PR people of this band did was that they took this 45 seconds, and then they turned it into a 2-minute video, and they put lyrics onto it afterwards, and then it became a sort of viral video in Russia. And so lots and lots of people were able to watch it. And of course, the idea was that since they were being punished for being in the opposition both to the church and to the government, that this was now kind of a worthy cause for liberal Russians to support. What I would like to finish on, because I think I would like to offer you the opportunity to ask some questions, is that, to put it very shortly, the return of Putin to the presidency has had negative consequences for the Russian Orthodox Church, because one of the reasons that all of a sudden there were publications about scandals relating to the church, you can trace that to a directive within the president's office to not necessarily discredit the church, but to sort of bring it back down. To say that, under Medvedev, you've gotten too powerful, you've gotten too much of what you wanted, but I, Putin, am now back in power, and, I don't, I am the power in the country, and I don't really need, a powerful Orthodox Church to, as a rival or as a sort of rival power center. So, and of course, I'm kind of giving you a very shorthand version of this because we don't have time to talk about more details of this, but one thing that I would like you to carry away from this is that the return of Putin to the presidency has actually meant the sort of scaling back of some of these advantages that the Orthodox Church was able to receive under Medvedev, and also the scaling back of this idea that Orthodoxy should be the dominant kind of national ideology in Russia, and that it should be kind of the center of Russian identity. This was something that under Medvedev had become quite a powerful idea. but over the last, say, half a year since Putin has become, or year since Putin has become president, once again, that has been actively scaled back, and it's been scaled back for all the reasons that I talked about before, which is that Putin, as we talked about during his first presidency, was actually somewhat, inclined towards a secular state and not one in which, religion had any serious kind of meaning, other than just sort of being something people do, on Sundays or in their spare time. So thank you very much for your attention, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to field them. Yes?
Do you think the election of Kirill refers to patriarch? Influenced the government have a favorite candidate?
Actually, paradoxically, yes, they had a favorite candidate who was not Kirill. And one of the reasons Kirill was elected was, and I know this because I interviewed some of the people who were at the council that elected him, a lot of people at this council did not like Kirill, but they elected him anyway because they thought the other guy would be worse, and he would have been worse. And from their perspective, he would have been worse because he actually was somebody that Putin liked. So, yes.
You mentioned in the early years, especially in that first part of Putin's term,
Sure.
And you talked about the restriction of other religions being able to come in and do missionary work, and being the one thing that the Orthodox Church got that they wanted. Do you see that as a connection to them really being able to lobby, or was this the case because it fell in line with some other desires by Putin, for example, to restrict outside influences and maybe pluralism in other ways? Is there a connection there at all?
Well, no, because the law that was passed in 1997 was still under Yeltsin. And Yeltsin actually was against the passage of that law initially, and it sort of took a lot of strong arming for the church and its allies to get him to sign the law in 1997. But I do think that you're right that it was not just the fact that the church was able to lobby the state. It also coincided with the fact that there were several other factors, one of which was that in the mid-90s, 95, 96, if you read Russian newspapers, they were full of scandals of so-called sects, chopping off the heads of their followers and doing all sorts of things. It's just brainwashing and whatever, and all of which, of course, was largely hysteria. But within Russian society, there was this kind of popular idea that we're under attack by these not just foreign but also homegrown new religions, and two things happened that sort of gave this credence. One of which was the attack by Aum Shinrikyo in the Tokyo metro station. Those of you, I'm not sure if you remember this, but there was a kind of massive gas attack by this Japanese religious group in Tokyo, which killed a lot of people. And it was discovered that the reason that this sect was able to have this gas was that it had actually been allowed to practice freely in Russia, and it had purchased all of the materials that it used later for this gas attack in Russia. And so the argument was that, well, in Russia we have full religious freedom, and look what it's causing havoc everywhere, and even in Japan people are dying because we have too much religious freedom. And it also coincided with the Jonestown scandal and a couple of other sort of really spectacular things that happened in the West, in the United States, for example, with David Koresh and the Branch Davidians, which was covered in the Russian media as this kind of hysterical idea that look at what these religions are doing, and we don't want them here. And so the Russian Orthodox Church was able to point to that and say, look, we're only asking for something that Russian society itself is asking for. So because of that, they were able to get it pushed through. But it had nothing to do with the desire of Putin or even Yeltsin to restrict pluralism necessarily.
Putin has kind of evolved in some of his rhetoric to be more overtly critical of the West, and tried to carve out more space for Russia as a Eurasian great power. Has he supported that with rhetoric stressing Russia as an Orthodox great power or Russia's Orthodox traditions? Because there's a lot of emphasis of pre-1917 traditions. Has the Orthodox part just not been included?
Well, it's been included, but it hasn't been sort of emphasized. It's been more included as when Putin or people around him talk about it, they talk about it as saying, oh, look, we have the Orthodox Church here, we have a large Islamic population, and look, they get along in a very Eurasian kind of way, like East meets West, we're all friends, and so we could be like a good model for, the West as it looks to try to figure out what to do with militant Islam, right? Because in our country, it's all good, which of course is not entirely true, but that's the space for it. I mean, so I don't want to suggest that under Putin there are no references to orthodoxy, but they're muted. I mean, they're not, any idea of bringing orthodoxy as the government ideology to replace communism or democracy or something. That's something that they've been very careful not to do. Are there any other questions? Yes.
I don't really know how to ask, but I'm just wondering, you mentioned a bit about just like sort of money scandals, and I was wondering if you can say anything more about potential like corruption in the Orthodox Church, or like what's going on there.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a very complicated question because one, and this is something that the Church itself hasn't had really figured out what to do about. They have a very untransparent financial structure. So the Church is supposed to financially support itself. It does not get subsidies from the government. I mean, it might get tax breaks. It might sometimes get, donations from the government and assistance in building something. But there is no government, unlike, for example, in Germany or some other European countries, there is no government salary for priests, for instance, or no government funding for the restoration of churches, or at least not officially. And so, because a lot of sort of services, like marriages and burials and baptisms, there is a tradition within the Russian Church to pay the priest to do that, right? And there are some churches which, sort of openly take more or less than others do. There are some accusations, and because the system is like that, because it's all under the table, of course there is room for corruption, of course there are rooms for abuse. The question of how far it goes is, of course, one that, is very difficult to answer. I mean, there's one scholar who's Nikolai Mitrokhin who has tried to do some work about that, but I think the last thing he published was like in 2005. I don't know if he's done anything since then. And he can trace some of that, but yeah, so. Yes.
Nowadays, how are the youth, like our age and even younger kids who weren't raised during the communist era, how are they approach the Orthodoxy religion?
Actually, that's a very interesting question, and it's one that I found a very surprising answer to, because if you look at sort of polls of Russians that have been conducted consistently over the past 10, 15 years, they will find that, the majority of Russians will say that they're Orthodox, and a very small minority, like 5 to 7%, will say that they go to church on a regular basis. What's interesting is that I did some research in Moscow. I did a survey at 10 Russian universities in Moscow. And some of them were Orthodox universities, but most of them were actually secular universities in places where the Russian elite actually is being trained, like Moscow State University and the Moscow Institute for Foreign Affairs. And there, I asked questions about their religiosity, how often they go to church, and about their political views. And what I found, oddly enough, and this was confirmed by priests whom I talked to, was that there the rate of people going to church on a regular basis was higher. It was about 20 to 25% of the youth who would be your age go to church on a regular basis. And there is some empirical basis for saying that that there is now a generation that in Russian would be called votsarkavlёnная, or churched in a sense, that has actually grown up with the tradition now, that is actually not just their parents being baptized and then not learning anything about the religion past that. So there is now a more significant element of the Russian youth turning towards Orthodoxy. But again, 20% is still not necessarily a lot. It's just bigger than the overall trend. Yes.
I know you briefly spoke about Putin's power. Do you think that he will be able to repeat what he did with Medvedev?
In which sense?
Kind of having another puppet after this next
Oh,
term.
well, I mean,
I know
it's
that's
an
a
interesting question because
tough
first of all, he has 5 years to the end of this one, and then he's legally, according to the Russian constitution, can be elected for another 6 years. So after this, I think you'll have to ask that question 11 years from now. I don't know. Lots of things can happen in 11 years. It's hard to predict. Are there any other questions? Well, if not, thank you so much for your attention and for your very warm welcome. Thank you.